9:15 in the morning, over the Strait of Hormuz. The descent was steep, involuntary, and tracked by every coastal radar station along the northern edge of the Persian Gulf. The C-17 Globemaster III, callsign Reach 824, was dropping at a rate of 3,000 feet per minute toward the Iranian coastline. The mission had been a standard logistics flight from Ramstein Air Base to the United Arab Emirates, but the master caution alarms were screaming a reality that the flight deck could not reconcile with the view outside. Somewhere in the electronics bay, a ghost was telling the aircraft that engine number 2 was a catastrophic fireball, even though the external cameras showed only the shimmering heat of the morning air. The cockpit was an oven of white light and flashing red indicators. The smell of recycled air and ozone thickened the nostrils of the pilots as they fought the flight control system. The Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment, dated 14 March 2026, had assessed Iranian signal spoofing capabilities as incapable of triggering internal flight control overrides or false positive fire warnings on heavy lift platforms. That assessment was the foundation of the flight path chosen by the Air Mobility Command, placing the aircraft within 30 miles of the Iranian coast. Now, the flight computer was slaving the throttle of the number 2 engine to idle, regardless of the physical inputs from Major Sarah Vance. The signature of the error was distinct, a specific frequency pulse that the crew would later identify as the logic bomb spoofing signature. It did not just jam the sensors, it rewrote the logic of the fire suppression system, making the aircraft believe its own destruction was imminent. Air traffic control at Bandar Abbas had been on the frequency within seconds of the first alarm, offering emergency landing clearance with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for the call. Vance looked at the horizon, where the jagged brown mountains of southern Iran met the turquoise water, and realized the aircraft was no longer hers to fly. The heavy transport touched down on the tarmac of Bandar Abbas International Airport. 9 minutes later, the tires screaming as they met the scorched concrete in the 100-degree heat. As the aircraft slowed, Vance did not taxi toward the civilian terminal, instead bringing the 60-ton machine to a halt on a taxiway between 2 hardened aircraft shelters. The silence that followed the engine shutdown was absolute, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant whine of sirens. Within 4 minutes, 3 white pickup trucks belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had boxed in the nose gear, while 2 armored personnel carriers took positions near the rear loading ramp. Outside, the air carried the sharp scent of salt spray and diesel exhaust, the humidity already beginning to fog the thick windows of the flight deck. Vance watched through the side pane as armed men in olive drab uniforms dismounted from the trucks, their weapons held at the low ready. The crew of 5 remained inside the armored cockpit, the heavy security door locked and the satellite data link pulsing a distress signal back to the combined Air Operations Center in Qatar. The signature element of the crisis was now undeniable. The logic bomb had not just forced them down, but had effectively tethered the aircraft to the ground by locking the digital brakes through the same spoofed maintenance channel. The cargo in, the hold was the true objective of the Iranian move, containing 3 spare radar arrays for the F-35, Lightning II fighters stationed in the Emirates. These were sensitive, highly classified components that the United States could not allow to be exploited or reverse-engineered by foreign/military intelligence services. On the ground, the Iranian commander approached the main crew entrance and hammered on the fuselage with the butt of a rifle, the sound echoing through the cavernous interior of the plane. Vance looked at her co-pilot, Captain Miller, whose hands were steady on the radio console as he began the first of many high-frequency transmissions. The standoff had begun, and the unanswered question of how a supposedly non-operational spoofing system had seized a U.S. Air Force heavy lifter now hung over the entire Persian Gulf. 10:15 in the morning. The tarmac at Bandar Abbas International Airport. The heat was a physical weight, rising in shimmering waves off the light gray concrete and distorting the shapes of the Revolutionary Guard armored vehicles that now formed a tight perimeter around the C-17. Major Sarah Vance watched the sweat drip from her chin and onto the flight suit fabric covering her knee. The air conditioning in the cockpit, having failed as the logic bomb signature, migrated from the fire suppression system into the environmental control bus. The air inside the flight deck was growing stale and heavy, smelling of copper and the recycled breath of 5 terrified but disciplined airmen. Outside, the Iranian sun beat down on the fuselage, turning the cargo hold into a pressurized oven for the sensitive electronics stored within. On the ground, a colonel in the Revolutionary Guard, identified by the ship's external cameras as a tactical commander with the Quds Force, stood 50 feet from the main crew entrance. He was not shouting. He was waiting. His professionalism was a stark contrast to the urgency felt by the crew. He knew the digital brakes were locked. He knew that even if Reach 824 could restart its 4 Pratt & Whitney F-117 engines, the aircraft would not budge. The Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment had claimed these systems were air-gapped from external signals, yet the aircraft sat paralyzed by a string of code that Vance could see but could not delete. The standoff moved into its second hour, with the arrival of a heavy maintenance van. 2 men in specialized protective gear dismounted, carrying what appeared to be industrial thermal cutters. Their objective was clear. They were going to bypass the airlock and the armored cockpit door to seize the crew and the F-35 radar arrays. Captain Miller adjusted the frequency on the high-frequency radio, his voice a low, steady murmur as he relayed the movement to the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar. The response from the theater commander was brief and cold. They were to hold the aircraft at all costs. Help was being organized, but the physics of the Persian Gulf meant that help was at least 90 minutes away. Inside the cargo bay, the 2 loadmasters had already begun the process of zeroizing the sensitive equipment. They moved with practiced efficiency, pulling the cryptographic keys from the radar modules and preparing the thermite strips that would melt the internal circuitry into a useless slag of silicon and lead. The smell of hydraulic fluid from a small leak in the ramp actuator hung in the stagnant air, mixing with the sharp, chemical scent of the cleaning agents used on the cargo pallets. Every time the guard commander hammered on the hull, the sound rang through the metal ribs of the plane like a tolling bell, a reminder that the skin of the aircraft was the only thing separating the crew from a foreign prison. 600 miles to the south, the bridge of the cruiser USS Philippine Sea was a hive of controlled motion. The ship was part of Carrier Strike Group 2, and it was currently the closest surface combatant to Bandar Abbas. The commanding officer stood at the central plot, watching the digital icons of Iranian coastal defense batteries light up across the tactical display. The intelligence gap was widening. The guard forces were not just reacting to a stray aircraft, they were executing a pre-planned recovery operation. The cruiser accelerated to 30 knots, the hull vibrating with the power of 4 gas turbine engines, carving a massive white wake through the dark blue waters of the Gulf of Oman. The signature element of the crisis, the digital lockout, was now being analyzed by cyber warfare specialists at Fort Meade. They had identified the logic bomb as a sophisticated piece of polymorphic code that had likely been dormant in the aircraft's maintenance log software for months, waiting for a specific geographic trigger. It was a failure of the highest order, proving that the supply chain for Air Mobility Command had been compromised long before Reach 824 ever left the ground in Germany. As the sun climbed higher, the Iranian colonel checked his watch and signaled to the men with the thermal cutters. The time for waiting had ended. The first sparks of the cutting torch hit the outer skin of the C-17, a bright white flare against the dull gray of the fuselage. 11:15 in the morning. The Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. Inside the windowless command bunker, the air was chilled to 64 degrees, smelling of ozone, stale coffee, and the static electricity of 1,000 server racks. The blue glow from the massive tactical displays cast long, flickering shadows across the faces of the intelligence officers and cyber warfare specialists. On the primary screen, The icon for Reach 824 remained a static yellow diamond over the coordinates 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 56 degrees 17 minutes east. The mission controllers were staring at a ghost in the machine that they had been told did not exist. The Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment, dated 14 March 2026, had assessed Iranian signal spoofing capabilities as incapable of triggering internal flight control overrides or false positive fire warnings on heavy lift platforms. This document was now being pulled up on secondary monitors, its red secret banners, a mocking reminder of the intelligence gap. The analysts at the National Security Agency had just confirmed the point of entry for the logic bomb. It had not come from a coastal transmitter or a high-powered jammer. It had been planted 3 weeks prior, during a routine maintenance check in Germany, delivered via a compromised diagnostic laptop that had injected the code into the aircraft's flight management computer. The code was designed to remain dormant until it received a specific low-frequency acoustic trigger, the exact sound signature of the Bandar Abbas coastal radar network. By Part 4 of the engagement, the failure of the 14th March assessment was total. The Iranian capability was not an experimental theory. It was a refined, operational weapon system that had effectively turned the C-17's own safety protocols into a cage. The realization rippled through the operations center, the sound of tapping keyboards and low-voiced updates suddenly replaced by a grim silence as the commanding officer of the 9th Air Force walked to the center of the room. The signature element of the crisis, the logic bomb lockout, was now preventing the crew from even venting the fuel tanks or purging the mission computers. The cyber specialists at Fort Meade were attempting to craft a kill code to send via satellite, but the Iranian Revolutionary Guard had already moved a mobile jamming vehicle within 50 meters of the aircraft. The interference was a thick blanket of white noise, cutting the satellite uplink to a crawl of 12 bits per second. Every 90 seconds, the logic bomb signature pulsed through the aircraft's internal data bus, a digital heartbeat that confirmed the Iranian control was holding firm. Outside the aircraft at Bandar Abbas, the physical reality was just as dire. The Iranian technicians had cleared the first layer of the hull near the crew entrance. The acrid stink of melting aluminum and the bright, magnesium-white sparks of the thermal cutters filled the air. Major Vance, listening through the thick door, could hear the metal groaning as the structural integrity of the frame began to give way. She had ordered the crew to don their oxygen masks, anticipating that the Iranians might use incapacitating gas once the breach was complete. The strategy was shifting from a diplomatic incident to a forced recovery. Carrier Strike Group 2 was still 60 miles out, but the first flight of FA-18 fighter jets had already launched from the deck of USS Gerald R. Ford. Their orders were to establish a combat air patrol just outside Iranian territorial waters, a show of force that the intelligence analysts now feared would be insufficient. The gap between the March assessment and the reality on the ground had left the United States with no good options and a clock that was rapidly running out. The sound of the thermal cutter finally bit through the last of the locking bolts, and the crew entrance door shifted a fraction of an inch inward. 12:15 in the afternoon. The edge of the Iranian territorial waters. The strike package, designated Rescue Force Alpha, crossed the imaginary line in the water at 500 knots. Leading the formation were 4 FA-18 Gulf Growlers, their wings packed with electronic jamming pods, followed closely by 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters carrying 24 operators from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The air was a hazy blur of heat and salt spray, the smell of jet fuel and sea air pressing into the cockpits of the low-flying helicopters. Below them, the dark green water of the Gulf was whipped into white foam by the rotors, as they maintained an altitude of only 50 feet to stay below the primary radar lobes of the coastal batteries. The failure of the 14th March intelligence assessment became a physical reality 3 minutes into the ingress. The briefing had assessed the Iranian signal spoofing capability as incapable of triggering flight control overrides. Yet, as the MH-60 Sierra helicopters approached the 10-mile mark, From Bandar Abbas, the lead pilot's flight stick began to vibrate with a rhythmic, mechanical shudder. On the primary flight display, the navigation system suddenly flipped, showing the helicopter's position as 300 miles inland. The logic bomb signature had not been confined to the maintenance logs of the C-17. It was a broad-spectrum broadcast, and it was now attacking the flight computers of the rescue force. Commander Robert Vance, the mission lead aboard the first Growler, watched his tactical screen dissolve into a mess of false primary targets. The assessment had been wrong about the scale and the reach. The Iranian electronic warfare units were not just targeting the grounded aircraft, they were creating a digital kill zone that extended 20 miles into the Strait of Hormuz. Vance toggled his encrypted radio, his voice calm despite the master caution light flickering on his own dashboard. He ordered the formation to switch to manual, analog flight, controls where possible, stripping away the computerized assistance that the logic bomb was currently devouring. On the ground at Bandar Abbas, the situation inside Reach 824 had reached a breaking point. The Iranian Quds Force technicians had successfully pried the crew entrance, door open by 6 inches. The sound of metal screaming against metal was a constant, grating screech that filled the cockpit. Major Sarah Vance could see the blue sky through the gap, a sliver of light that was quickly obscured by the black barrel of a rifle being jammed through the opening. The logic bomb signature pulsed one final time, and the aircraft's massive rear loading ramped the primary access to the F-35 radar arrays began to groan as its hydraulic locks were remotely disengaged by the Iranian code. The intelligence gap had left the United States Navy at a tactical disadvantage that no amount of firepower could immediately fix. The Growlers began to fire high-speed anti-radiation missiles at the coastal radar sites, the white smoke trails of the AGM-88, missiles carving arcs across the cloudless sky. Each launch felt like a desperate gamble. If the spoofing was as advanced as it appeared, the missiles might just as easily turn back on the ships that fired them. The air was thick with the invisible weight of electronic interference, a silent war being fought across frequencies that the March assessment had claimed were safe. The signature element of the engagement, the logic bomb's ability to seize hydraulic systems, was now fully manifest. As the rear ramp of the C-17 hit the tarmac, with a heavy, echoing thud, the Iranian commandos did not wait. They swarmed the opening, their boots clattering on the first metal incline. At that exact moment, the 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters cleared the harbor breakwater, their door gunners opening fire with 7.62mm miniguns to suppress the perimeter. The transition from a standoff to a kinetic breach happened in a heartbeat, the silence of the morning shattered by the rhythmic thumping of heavy machine guns and the roar of low-flying jets. 1 in the afternoon. The northern taxiways of Bandar Abbas International Airport. The 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters hovered at 15 feet, their rotor wash kicking up a blinding cyclonic storm of sand, dried grass, and discarded plastic from the runway edge. Before the landing gear could even touch the concrete, 12 operators from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group were out the doors, sliding down thick nylon fast ropes into the heat. The air was a suffocating 105 degrees, smelling of burnt kerosene and the metallic tang of the minigun fire that was still chewing into the Iranian technicals parked near the aircraft's nose. The first operator to hit the ground, a Master Chief Petty Officer, did not wait for his feet to settle before raising his M4 carbine and placing a 3-round burst into the engine block of the nearest white pickup truck. The boarding of Reach 824 was a calculated, violent synchronization of movement and suppression. While the door gunners on the helicopters maintained a wall of 7.62mm fire to keep the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps infantry pinned behind the hardened aircraft shelters, the Special Operations team split into 2 elements. Team Blue headed for the now open crew entrance door near the nose, while Team Red charged up the lowered rear cargo ramp. The signature element of the engagement, the logic bomb spoofing signature, was now manifesting in a new, disorienting way. The internal lighting system of the C-17 had been hijacked by the code, causing the overhead LED panels to strobe at a frequency of 15 cycles per second, creating a nauseating flickering effect that played havoc with the operator's night vision optics. Inside the cargo hold, the scene was one of total chaos. 4 members of the Iranian Quds Force had already made it halfway up the ramp, their boots slipping on a patch of hydraulic fluid that had leaked from a severed line. The lead Iranian soldier was thrown backward as a flashbang grenade, tossed by the first Navy SEAL up the ramp, detonated with a bone-shaking crack that sucked the air out of the hold for a split second. The smell of magnesium and burnt carpet filled the interior, the strobe lights turning the smoke into a jagged, frozen landscape. The Iranian soldiers, though disoriented, were disciplined. They did not retreat. They took cover behind a pallet of aircraft tires and returned fire with their AK-47 rifles, the tracers bouncing off the titanium floor plates of the C-17 in a shower of white sparks. In the cockpit, Major Sarah Vance and her crew were trapped between the strobe-lit hold and the locked security door. Miller had his Glock 19 pistol aimed at the reinforced glass of the door, watching as the shadows of the boarders danced. In the strobing light of the hold, through the high-frequency radio, they could hear the voice of the Navy SEAL commander calling out room clearances with a mechanical, emotionless rhythm. The tactical objective was clear: secure the F-35 radar arrays, located in the center of the hold before the Iranian technicians could restart the thermal cutters or plant demolition charges. The intelligence failure from the 14th March assessment had forced this close-quarters battle, a situation the United States Navy had desperately hoped to avoid. The Special Operations operators moved with a lethality that ignored the disorienting light. Team Red pushed through the cargo bay, utilizing the strobe effect to mask their own movements, firing in short, controlled bursts that neutralized the Iranian boarding party within 90 seconds. 3 Iranian soldiers were down on the ramp, their blood mixing with the dark hydraulic fluid to create a slick, crimson smear across the gray metal. The 4th Iranian was driven back out onto the tarmac, where he was immediately suppressed by the hovering Sierra helicopters. The interior of the C-17 was now a graveyard of electronics and spent brass, the acrid stink of gunpowder so thick it triggered the aircraft's smoke alarms, adding a high-pitched electronic wail to the cacophony of the battle. Despite securing the hold, the mission was far from over. The mission was far from over. The logic bomb signature was still active, and through the cockpit windows, Vance could see a second wave of Iranian armored vehicles, these ones heavier, BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles emerging from the maintenance hangars 300 meters away. The Special Operations Team lead keyed his radio, reporting that the radar arrays were secure, but the aircraft remained digitally tethered to the ground. They had the cargo, they had the crew, but they had no way to move the 60-ton transport. The logistics of the extraction were now the primary concern. As the heavier Iranian forces began to find the range of the grounded aircraft with 30mm autocannon fire, 1:15 in the afternoon, the airfield perimeter at Bandar Abbas, the tactical situation transitioned from a surgical breach to a high-stakes siege, as the first of 3 Iranian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles crested a low rise near the fuel farm, 400 meters west of the grounded C-17. The vehicle's 30mm autocannon began to bark in rhythmic 3-round bursts, the high-explosive incendiary shells chewing into the tarmac and sending jagged shards of concrete into the air like lethal hail. One of the MH-60 Sierra helicopters, hovering low to provide suppression, was forced to bank hard to the north, its flare dispensers firing a blinding sequence of magnesium decoys as it masked its profile behind a hangar. The Naval Special Warfare operators had established a 3-point defensive perimeter around the aircraft's landing gear, using the massive titanium struts and the open rear ramp as cover. The air was a thick, choking soup of white phosphorus smoke, pulverized concrete, and the acrid stench of burning rubber from the C-17's nose tires, which had been shredded by the initial Iranian fire. The signature element, the logic bomb spoofing signature, continued to cycle through the aircraft's internal systems every 60 seconds, resetting the digital brakes and preventing the crew from even attempting a low-speed taxi. The Special Operations Team lead, a lieutenant commander with 14 years of experience, realized that they could not fly the aircraft out. They would have to defend it until a heavy lift recovery could be organized, or prepare to destroy the 60-ton airframe entirely. Logistics and casualty management became the primary focus within the hold of the aircraft. One of the loadmasters, Technical Sergeant James Miller, had been struck in the upper thigh by a ricochet during the initial Iranian boarding attempt. The wound was deep, the blood bright and arterial, against the gray non-skid flooring. A Navy SEAL medic worked over him in the strobing light of the cargo bay, applying a combat tourniquet and a dressing of hemostatic gauze, while the air around them vibrated with the impact of 30mm rounds hitting the outer fuselage. The sound was like being trapped inside a giant drum being struck by a sledgehammer, a terrifying metallic resonance that made communication nearly impossible. Overhead, the tactical coordination was managed by an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye circling 40 miles out over the Strait of Hormuz. The air controller's voice was a calm, steady presence in the ears of the ground team, reporting that 2 FA-18 Golf Growlers were moving into position to conduct a high-speed pass. Their mission was to drop a sequence of precision-guided munitions on the approaching BMP-2 vehicles, but the intelligence gap persisted. The Iranian coastal batteries had switched to a passive optical tracking system that the Growler's electronic jamming suites could not suppress. The 14th March assessment had failed to account for this backup infrastructure, leaving the American jets vulnerable to short-range infrared missiles. The Special Operations Team began the desperate task of offloading the F-35 radar arrays. Each crate weighed 400 pounds and required a motorized pallet jack to move. Because the logic bomb had seized the hydraulic systems of the C-17, the operators were forced to use manual hand cranks to operate the internal crane. The work was grueling, every muscle in their bodies screaming, under the 105-degree heat. Sweat soaked through their body armor, stinging their eyes, and making their grip on the metal crates slick and uncertain. They were working against a clock that was being measured in the distance between the approaching Iranian armor and the aircraft's thin skin. As the second BMP-2 rounded the corner of the maintenance hangar, it fired a wire-guided anti-tank missile. The projectile corkscrewed through the air, trailing a thin copper wire, and slammed into the ground just 20 feet from the C-17's nose. The shockwave threw 2 operators off their feet and shattered the cockpit windows, showering Major Vance and Captain Miller in a spray of safety glass. The smell of high explosives and scorched earth filled the flight deck. The tactical report from the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye indicated that more Iranian reinforcements, including a company of T-90S tanks, were mobilizing from a base 10 miles to the north. The window for a successful extraction was closing, and the American forces were now forced to weigh the value of the radar arrays against the lives of the 30 personnel currently trapped on the tarmac. 1:30 in the afternoon. The center of the Bandar Abbas airfield. The tail rotor of the lead MH-60 Sierra helicopter vanished in a jagged explosion of white fire and shredded carbon fiber before any of the crew heard the launch. The impact was a brutal, physical shock that punched through the air, followed immediately by the high-pitched scream of titanium gears being ground into dust. The helicopter did not simply drop. It began a violent, uncompensated yaw to the right. The air around it filled with the metallic tang of vaporized hydraulic fluid and the scent of scorched electronics. 3 seconds prior, a MiSOG-2 infrared missile had cleared its launch tube from the darkened interior of the North Maintenance Hangar. The Iranian operator had used a passive optical sight, an analog solution that the 14th March intelligence assessment had claimed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was too poorly trained to utilize in a high-intensity electronic environment. The missile had tracked the heat of the helicopter's twin engines with perfect, unjammable precision. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reed was thrown against his shoulder harness with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. His hands were a blur of motion as he fought the collective, his left foot jammed hard into the anti-torque pedal. But there was no resistance, only the dead, hollow vibration of severed control cables. Beside him, the co-pilot was screaming over the internal comms as the ground rushed up to meet them. The Sierra slammed into the tarmac, 60 yards from the nose of the C-17, the main rotors shattering against the concrete in a sequence of bone-shaking cracks. Lethal fragments of composite blade were sent whistling through the air like shrapnel, one of which sliced through the aluminum skin of a nearby airport fuel truck, though the tank did not ignite. A thick column of oily black smoke rose instantly from the wreckage, masking the surviving crew as they scrambled out of the side doors, their boots slipping on the slick, sun-heated concrete. The loss of the lead helicopter shifted the tactical balance of the rescue force from a controlled extraction to a desperate survival operation. The second MH-60 Sierra, seeing its wingman go down, banked hard toward the south, its door gunner saturating the roof of the maintenance hangar with 500 rounds of 7.62mm fire. The heat of the exchange was visible in the air, a shimmering haze that made the outlines of the Iranian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles appear like predatory ghosts. The signature element, the logic bomb spoofing signature, now triggered a secondary protocol in the C-17's avionics. The aircraft's external landing lights began to cycle rapidly, flashing a distress code that illuminated the rising smoke and the grit-choked air of the tarmac in rhythmic, blinding pulses. Inside the C-17, the Naval Special Warfare operators were forced to abandon the manual offloading of the second radar array. The shockwave from the helicopter crash had buckled the rear loading ramp just enough to jam the hand crank mechanism. The lieutenant commander in charge of the team made the call to switch to Scorched Earth protocols. The intelligence failure from the March assessment meant they could no longer guarantee the security of the airfield long enough for a surface recovery. The operators began to pack the interior of the F-35 radar crates with C4 plastic explosives, their hands steady even as 30mm autocannon rounds from the Iranian BMP-2s began to punch through the aircraft's upper fuselage, showering the hold in a rain of white-hot magnesium sparks. Logistics for the evacuation were now critical. There were now 5 downed aircrew from the helicopter crash who needed to be integrated into the defensive perimeter. The Navy SEAL medic, already treating the loadmaster's arterial bleed, was joined by a second corpsman who began triaging the helicopter pilots for concussions and spinal trauma. The air in the cargo hold was becoming unbreathable, a mixture of cordite, jet fuel, and the chemical fire suppressant that had been triggered by the autocannon hits. Every man in the hold was breathing through a filtered mask, the sound of their own labored inhalation, the only constant in the roar of the battle. Outside, the second wave of Iranian infantry was moving in under the cover of the smoke from the downed Sierra. They were using the logic bomb's interference to mask their own short-range radio communications, moving in a coordinated pincer toward the C-17's nose. Carrier Strike Group 2 had authorized a danger-close airstrike, and 2 FA-18 Golf Growlers were currently 2022, screaming toward the airfield at Mach 1.2. They were no longer worrying about electronic warfare. They were coming in with heavy, unguided ordnance, a desperate measure to buy the ground team the 3 minutes they needed to finish the demolition of the classified cargo. The transition back to the main narrative was marked by a sudden, eerie silence on the Iranian side as they realized the American jets were seconds away from dropping their payloads. 1:35 in the afternoon, the airfield at Bandar Abbas, the sky above the airport, was suddenly torn open by the scream of 2 FA-18 Golf Growlers arriving at 500 feet and a speed of 600 knots. They did not use precision-guided munitions. The logic bomb signature was still saturating the local frequencies, making laser designation unreliable. Instead, they dropped 12 500-pound unguided Mark 82 bombs in a tight carpet across the northern taxiway. The impact was a rolling thunder that shook the very foundation of the terminal building, the shockwaves blowing out every remaining window within 300 meters and throwing a wall of dust and fire 200 feet into the air. The lead BMP-2 was lifted entirely off its tracks by a near miss, its turret spinning into the air before the vehicle was consumed by a secondary explosion of its own fuel and ammunition. In the brief pause provided by the airstrike, the second MH-60 Sierra helicopter flared hard over the smoldering wreckage of the first. The pilot held the aircraft in a hover just inches above the blood-slick tarmac, her door gunners pouring a continuous stream of fire into the Iranian infantry positions near the hangars. The surviving crew from the crashed helicopter, 3 pilots and 2 gunners, scrambled toward the open doors, their movements jerky and desperate as they hauled their wounded commander across the open ground. The air was a cacophony of rotor slap, screaming jet engines, and the rhythmic thud of heavy machine guns, all filtered through the thick, choking haze of the white phosphorus screen. Inside Reach 824, the Naval Special Warfare Team lead pressed the detonation remote for the C-4 charges. He did not look back as he led his team and the C-17 flight crew down the rear ramp. The signature element, the logic bomb signature, had one final trick. As the crew cleared the ramp, the code triggered the signature ramp, the logic bomb, aircraft's fire suppression system, dumping hundreds of gallons of toxic foam into the hold in a futile attempt to save the burning airframe. It did not matter. 3 seconds after the last operator boarded the rescue helicopter, the thermite charges inside the F-35 radar arrays ignited, followed instantly by the C-4 blocks. The interior of the C-17 erupted in a white-hot flash that melted the titanium floor plates and severed the main wing spars, ensuring that no piece of classified technology would ever be recovered by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The logistics of the withdrawal were becoming a nightmare of weight and fuel. The surviving MH-60 Sierra was now carrying 22 personnel, nearly double its rated capacity for a high-heat extraction. The engines groaned under the strain, the rotor blades biting into the thin, 105-degree air with a sound like tearing silk. As the pilot pulled the collective to lift off, the helicopter shuddered violently, the weight of the extra men and the wounded forcing her to execute a running takeoff across the taxiway rather than a vertical climb. They were moving at 80 knots, skimming just 10 feet above the ground, heading toward the southern perimeter fence and the safety of the open sea. Casualty management was being conducted on the floor of the vibrating helicopter. The Navy SEAL medic was now working on 3 separate patients: the loadmaster with the arterial bleed, the commander from the Dane crashed Sierra with a compound fracture of the femur, and a special operations operator who had taken a fragment of 30mm shell to the shoulder. The cabin was a cramped, bloody workspace, smelling of sweat, iron, and the acrid smoke clinging to the men's uniforms. They were 40 miles from the USS Gerald R. Ford, a distance that felt like 1,000 miles as the Iranian coastal batteries began to reset their optical trackers for a final shot at the fleeing aircraft. The intelligence failure of the 14th March assessment had reached its final kinetic conclusion. The United States had lost a major strategic transport and a multi-million-dollar helicopter because they had underestimated a digital weapon. As the Sierra cleared the harbor breakwater and banked hard to the west, the crew looked back to see the remains of the C-17 engulfed in a pillar of orange fire and thick gray smoke that climbed 3,000 feet into the afternoon sky. The mission had shifted from a rescue to a retreat, and the cost of the miscalculation was still being tallied in the blood of the men on the floor of the aircraft. 1:45 in the afternoon, 12 miles south of Bandar Abbas, over the dark turquoise waters of the Strait of Hormuz. The overloaded MH-60 Sierra helicopter was a vulnerable, low-flying target, its engines screaming at 105% power, just to maintain an altitude of 80 feet. The cabin was a scene of grim, focused intensity, the floor slick with hydraulic fluid and blood, as the 22 survivors clung to the airframe's internal ribs. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Jessica Vance, fought a continuous vibration in the flight stick, a physical echo of the logic bomb signature that was still attempting to override the helicopter's fly-by-wire stabilizers. Behind them, the column of smoke from the destroyed C-17 stood like a black monument against the hazy Iranian coastline. The Iranian response to the airfield strike was immediate and airborne. Two 14 Tomcats, survivors of the previous decade's airframe sustainment programs, had scrambled from a secondary alert strip 5 miles inland. They were closing. At Mach 1.4, their powerful AN/AWG-9 radars attempting to burn through the electronic noise. The 14 March intelligence assessment had not only failed to predict the logic bomb, but had also characterized these specific Iranian interceptors as non-mission capable due to lack of spare parts. That assessment was proven false as the 14 Tomcats locked their long-range missiles onto the retreating rescue helicopter. Protecting the Sierra was a 4-ship flight of Fa-18 Golf Growlers and Super Hornets from Carrier Strike Group 2. The Growlers, led by Commander Robert Vance, moved into a defensive wall between the helicopter and the approaching interceptors. This was the final proving ground for the signature element of the crisis. At exactly 1:51 in the afternoon, the cyber warfare specialists at Fort Meade finally pushed the kill code through the satellite link to the Growlers. The command was simple: A broad-spectrum burst designed to mimic the logic bomb's own frequency, but with a destructive parity bit that would crash any system running the Iranian code. The effect was instantaneous and visible on the tactical displays. The logic bomb signature, which had been tethering the American electronics for nearly 5 hours, vanished from the Growler's screens. Free from the digital interference, the two Fa-18 Golfs unleashed a torrent of electronic noise that completely blinded the Iranian Tomcats. The Iranian pilots, suddenly unable to see their targets or even maintain a radar lock, were forced to break their intercept heading and dive toward the deck to avoid the American AIM-120 missiles that were now tracking them with lethal clarity. The air shield had held, but the margin of victory was measured in seconds. At coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 56 degrees 5 minutes east, the rescue helicopter finally crossed the invisible line into international airspace. The tension in the cabin did not break, but it shifted. The medic continued to pump air into the lungs of the wounded loadmaster, while the Navy SEALs checked their remaining ammunition, their faces masked by a layer of salt, soot, and exhaustion. The United States Navy cruiser Philippine Sea was now visible on the horizon, its 5-inch gun trained toward the coast and its own flight deck prepped for an emergency landing. The air shield remained in place for another 20 minutes as the Sierra made its final approach to the cruiser. The logistics of the recovery were complex. The Philippine Sea was not designed to hang on to 22 personnel and a damaged helicopter simultaneously. As the Sierra's wheels touched the deck, the engines were shut down immediately, the blades slowing to a halt in the hot, humid wind of the Gulf. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shouting of the deck crew and the distant thunder of the Fa-18 fighters overhead. The mission was tactically complete, but the strategic wreckage of the 14th March assessment lay scattered across the airfield behind them. The cost of the spectac, intelligence failure, was no longer a theoretical debate in a windowless room. It was the smell of burnt flesh and the sight of a 60-ton aircraft turned into a funeral pyre. 6:15 in the evening. The flight deck of the cruiser USS Philippine Sea. The silence that followed the final shutdown of the MH-60 Sierra's engines was heavier than the roar that had preceded it. As the massive rotors slowed to a rhythmic, agonizing stop, the only sound left was the ticking of cooling metal and the frantic shouting of the United States Navy medical teams as they swarmed the blood-slicked cabin. The humidity of the Persian Gulf clung to everything, mixing with the acrid stink of burnt powder, ozone, and the copper-sweet smell of drying blood that had permeated the helicopter's interior. The crew did not cheer. They did not celebrate the crossing of the maritime boundary. They simply sat in the shadows of the airframe, their eyes wide and hollow, staring at a deck that felt unnervingly stable after the chaos of the airfield. The offloading of the casualties was a systematic, grim procession. Technical Sergeant James Miller was the first out, his face a mask of gray exhaustion as the corpsman lifted his stretcher. The combat tourniquet on his upper thigh was a dark, saturated red, a physical testament to the price paid for the security of a few crates of electronics. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reed, the pilot of the downed Sierra, was carried toward the ship's infirmary with his eyes closed. His body broken by the force of the impact that the 14 March assessment had suggested was a remote possibility. The hull of the Philippine Sea, usually a pristine example of American naval power, bore the scars of the day's violent scuffed deck netting and deep gouges in the non-skid coating where the overloaded rescue helicopter had slammed down with nearly twice its rated landing weight. The loss of Reach 824 was a catastrophic blow to the Air Mobility Command's regional fleet. A 60-ton strategic asset, valued at over $200 million, was now nothing more than a blackened skeleton on the tarmac of Bandar Abbas. The signature element of the crisis, the logic bomb spoofing signature, had been neutralized within the fleet's servers. But the digital infection had already done its work. It had exposed a vulnerability in the global supply chain that could not be patched with a simple line of code. The March 14th intelligence assessment, which had once been a document of certainty, was now being archived as a case study in institutional hubris. It had assessed the Iranian capability as non-operational, yet that very capability had dictated every move of the engagement, from the first phantom fire alarm to the final, desperate airstrike. In the hangar bay of the cruiser, the Naval Special Warfare operators began the process of cleaning their equipment. They moved like machines, stripping down rifles that were fouled with the grit of the Iranian coast and the residue of the white phosphorus screens. There was no conversation. The lieutenant, commander in charge of the team, stood by the railing, watching the wake of the ship as it moved further south into the safety of the open sea. He held the detonation remote in his hand, a small plastic device that had been the instrument of the C-17's destruction. He had achieved the tactical objective. The F-35 radar arrays were molten slag, unrecoverable by the adversary, but the achievement felt hollow against the weight of the men currently undergoing surgery. 3. Decks below. The shift toward the philosophical tone of the final hour was inescapable. This was the new reality of the Strait. A theater where the lines between a routine cargo flight and a regional war were blurred by a few strings of polymorphic code. The United States had entered the morning with a belief in its own electronic invulnerability, a belief that had been dismantled by an adversary that utilized the gap between what intelligence predicted and what the reality on the ground demanded. The power of the carrier strike group remained undisputed, but the shield of technological superiority had been proven to be a porous thing, capable of being bypassed by a dormant logic bomb planted in a maintenance laptop weeks before the first shot was fired. The final tally of the engagement was a sobering list of material and human loss. 1 C-17 Globemaster III destroyed. 1 MH-60 Sierra helicopter lost. 3 civilian vehicles on the Bandar Abbas tarmac incinerated. 4 Iranian soldiers confirmed dead on the ramp of the transport. For the United States, the cost was measured in the shattered femur of a decorated pilot, the permanent disability of a veteran loadmaster, and the psychological trauma of a crew that had been betrayed by their own aircraft's logic. The Philippine Sea continued its slow, steady transit away from the coast. The orange glow of the setting sun reflecting off the empty space on the post flight deck where the second rescue helicopter should have been parked. The mission had ended not with a victory, but with the quiet, persistent ache of a debt that could not be repaid by a successful extraction.